Thanks, Tim. It is, I hope, strength and testimony to the strength of the relationship and the collaborative nature of the relationships across the sector that Tim and I are fronting this presentation together. The RAB started through what at the time, 20 years ago, was a truly unique cross-industry collaboration. All of the major radio groups at the time, EMAP, Capital, GWR, SRH, so on, Virgin, all getting together for the very first time to front a collective sell of radio. The reality is we've got to work alongside the BBC today. Yes, of course, we're going to compete ferociously for audience, and I'll come on and talk that in a second. But, you know, BBC was Brand of the Year yesterday at the Marketing Week Awards, just as we won the sort of research project of the year for the emotional multiplier. What we've got to do is come up with the propositions and the listener interaction that makes radio on commercial stations compelling for advertisers and for agencies alike. But we've got to do that in a way that's looking forward and facing the future and the challenges that we face on a cross-industry basis. And I genuinely believe we're at a moment now that is very close to the same moment that we were at with the RAB 20 years ago. There were actually three brilliant organisations that all came together in the early 90s, inspired by the RAB, of course, but not only the RAB, but also Radar, when we came together with the BBC to transform the sort of listening methodology, and also, of course, the establishment of JET and JICRIT and NatJIC and the sort of cross-industry trading. Now, this is just the modern manifestation of that. And what the commercial sector has now got to do is get our proposition right for both listeners and, of course, for advertisers that gives us the opportunity to compete. And I think we're beginning to do that. I think we're at the start of a journey that will continue to transform this industry. It's only the start. I mean, I only came to RadioCentre in 2006, as Linda mentioned, sort of 5.5, 6 years ago. In that time, about 90% of commercial radio's revenues has changed ownership. You know, we're at the start of a journey that is transforming this sector, transforming the opportunities for advertisers and their agencies. And I want to share three strategic pillars as I think the changes that you're beginning to see that I think is keeping commercial radio very fresh, very relevant. The first is the change that David touched on, and it's great that David was able to reference the growth of national brands. It is easily forgotten. You know, in 1922, when the BBC was formed, to 1992, when the RAB was formed, and of course I quite like that symmetry in terms of the size and relevance of those organisations, for 70 years there wasn't a national commercial radio station. And it's extraordinary in terms of the probability, the opportunity and the ability for us to engage with national advertisers. We didn't have a medium. I remember being a brand manager on major national brands, and you just couldn't buy any national property, apart, incidentally, from the chart show, which Tim had already nicked for Pepsi. Over the last 20 years, we've transformed that offer from what was originally just 5 national BBC stations to now a whole plethora of commercial stations. Of course, it started with the first 3 national INRs, what at the time, of course, was Classic and Talk Radio, and Virgin at the time, now, of course, Talk Sport and Absolute. But I don't think anybody 20 years ago, despite how David sort of referenced it with hindsight, would have necessarily anticipated that, you know, a national commercial classical station could be 3 times the size and 3 times as successful as Radio 3, when if ever there was a BBC station that encapsulated and typified the benefits of sort of public service broadcasting and particular targeting of a sort of a niche audience. We've developed that offer over the last few years with 2 further sort of steps. The first has been, of course, is the sewing together of some of our great FM networks to create quasi-national brands, be that Heart, be it Capital, be it KISS, be it Smooth, and with all of the major players now engaged in sort of quasi-national offerings. And, of course, we're beginning to see the traction and the growth of DAB, listening via a DAB set now up to 30% of the population, beginning to now get some real sort of traction, and that facilitating the growth of national brands like Jazz FM, like Planet Rock from the commercial side, as well, of course, as facilitating the growth of Six Music, which won Station of the Year at the Sonys for the BBC. That combination of national brands is a critical strategic pillar for commercial radio going forward. You know, we've finally got, I think, some national propositions that for national advertisers facilitate a real game-changing opportunity. And I am absolutely convinced across the next 5, 10, 15 years, the combination of Capital and KISS will give Radio 1 a run for its money, that Magic and Heart and Smooth will give Radio 2 a run for its money, that Classic will continue to beat, you know, Radio 3, that the Vodafone Big Top 40 show will continue to be the chart show, that TalkSport will continue to compete with Radio 5 Live. That's axiomatic in terms of the proposition that we deliver on a national basis for national advertisers. But it doesn't forget the critical role that commercial radio continues to play on a local level. We know that and understand it from our bigger groups, particularly Global, Heart, Global, Bauer, GMG, of course, whose bedrock and whose heartland is in local radio. But also, we continue to have a strong underlying core of smaller local groups. It doesn't matter whether it's Kent Messenger Group in Kent, Celador across the south of England, Links FM in Lincolnshire, Free Radio from Orion in the sort of West Midlands. We have clusters of strong embedded local stations, deeply embedded in their communities, and we know at a local level we continue to win hands down on market share against BBC local radio. That combination is a terrifically powerful proposition for advertisers. And if we get that listener proposition right, then everything else, of course, follows. And I firmly believe that we've finally got the investment, the ownership changes, the brand structures beginning to fall in place, that you'll begin to see, I think, an acceleration of that growth and development over the next decade. The second major change has been how we're taking our brands, taking our station properties, and extending that listener engagement beyond the airwaves. I remember when I joined RadioCentre sort of 5 or 6 years ago, at that time, S&P, sponsorship and promotions, was about 12 or 13% of overall radio revenues. We were still primarily a spot advertising business. We had ambitions to grow that, but it wasn't necessarily something that we were completely delivering on. The reality is we have absolutely transformed our business in the last 5 years. And if there ever was an example of a medium that has truly embraced online, mobile, events, social networking, and brought all that panoply of offerings together, it's commercial radio. And you only have, or radio in entirety, and you only have to look at the traction and engagement of the proms on Radio 3 and the live experience that comes with that, or the traction and engagement of the summertime ball on Capital to sense how that all comes together. And radio's always been mobile. We always had the benefit 15, 20 years ago of being available, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, as you moved around the house, in the car. But in reality, we weren't really that mobile. Once you left the house, you didn't get that much connection with radio during the working day, in the office or on public transport or out walking or running. The reality is that what's happened with the new mobile digital devices is radio sits naturally on all of them, whether it's an MP3 player, whether it's a mobile phone, whether it's a tablet. All of that is bringing new listening, new occasions for radio, and the bandwidth with which we're consuming is very incredibly modest. So the reality is this is all net extra occasions for radio. It's relatively easy and simple for listeners to consume. It's relatively inexpensive for listeners to consume, and it's only helping boost our hours and our reach, despite the sort of plethora of digital opportunity that's out there. And it all comes together critically and importantly with what Tim said, talking about Radio Player. This has been an extraordinarily important initiative. It started as, how do we harmonise and thread together our online offerings for the benefit of listeners, and indeed, therefore, from a commercial sector, in turn, for advertisers. 3 years ago, you had, 300-odd stations in the UK. All of them had a different interface. All of them had a different online interaction, different way of using graphics, different ways of playing a live stream, different protocols, different metadata, a complete sort of, inelegant sort of user experience for the consumer. We've harmonized all that down into one clear, consistent interface. It's been extraordinarily successful. We've now got over 7 million listeners listen to radio every day through the Radio Player. But the critical thing is that has become a vehicle for us to redesign the interface for the industry going forward. And if you think, as Tim's talked about, with screens and digital technology moving forward, we need an interface for radio that's going to work on mobile, that's going to work on tablets, that's going to work on UView. All of that's going to work on connected devices in the car that also have internet protocol in the future, that's going to work on receivers. That requires an interface and a metadata that is aggregated up for the industry, is intuitively simple for consumers, and enables us to be forward-facing for advertisers going forward. By doing the heavy lifting now and getting that proposition all at once, so you literally can have, the same interface. There's Planet Rock up there now where there was Radio 1 before. We're building the back end to make things very simple for listeners. Going forwards then, it just means we can compete like hell, as I've touched on the content. And I think if we can get that combination right, we're really poised for growth. And all of these new devices are changing the face of our industry extraordinarily quickly. I mean, I was talking with David just outside from BT, and he quoted me again the figure that there's 1.2 million, there's 1.2 handsets for every member of the UK population on mobile phones. There's 60-odd million handsets. Even if you allow for all the duplication and replacement cycles, we estimate there's about 20 million new handsets that are sold under contract each year. That's 20 million radios. A mobile phone is a radio that makes calls. And it's extraordinary the depth of change and engagement that we're beginning to see and that we're on top of capturing. And you put that with these strong branded propositions at both the national and local level, and you begin, I think, to start to develop a pretty devastating combination. The final thing that's changed in the last 4 or 5 years is, I think, a good example of where RadioCentre, from a sort of lobbying, regulatory, sort of government relations sort of side of things, can try and help our relationships with advertisers. And it's been around the relaxation of the broadcast code. We've always, I think, been able to say to advertisers, look, we're pretty good at being able to integrate your content into our programming. We're live, we have the editorial curation and so on that DJs bring. We always have the possibility to do more for your brands than a straightforward up and down advert that you might see in other media. But in reality, we were fairly constrained as to how far we could take that forward, because inevitably there were rules around the promotions of products and services, the relative levels of prominence, and the separation of editorial and advertising that constrained our operations to a certain extent. With the relaxation of the broadcast code that happened at the start of last year, we've now had 15, 16 months of living with changes to how we can promote your brands, the sort of prominence, the sort of endorsement we can give them. And you bring that in combination with the sort of multi-platform development of the businesses and the brand propositions, and I think you start to have an incredibly coherent proposition from us, from a programming and a listening point of view, from which to compete with the BBC, but from an advertiser and an agency point of view, from which to compete with all the other media, which will also be, of course, competing for advertisers' time. You put that together, and we have a sensational opportunity to harness listener communities. If you look at the sort of work that Vodafone are doing at the moment, that morphs out of the big top 40 show into the whole engagement around the summertime ball, all around early access to tickets, around the mobile experience, around a live event, around the social networking that goes with it, you truly begin to develop media properties around which you can launch your brands and connect with your consumers in a way that I think is truly devastating and truly transformational for the industry going forward. So what we'll try to do together is Tim and I will try and guide the industry, let's collaborate on the future technology and the future platforms. Let's agree the standards, let's agree the metadata, let's agree how we report it across Radar, both from an online diary point of view and also looking at internet-delivered audience measurement. Let's get all the back office and all the protocols in place. Then let's compete like hell on content across a succession of fabulous brands with multiple engagement opportunities, multiple touch points, and with a regulatory regime which now facilitates us doing our very best to deliver the messages you want for your advertisers. Thanks.